Rain pounded against the windshield as Mina drove down a desolate highway, her headlights barely cutting through the torrential downpour. She was a lone traveler, drawn to exploration and the thrill of discovering new places. Nights like this were familiar to her, driving down unfamiliar roads, seeking new experiences, when she saw a sign emerge from the darkness reading, "Welcome to Cottage City." A wave of relief washed over her. Mina continued driving, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. She drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town seemed frozen in time. A house caught her eye, a crumbling structure on the roadside, abandoned and eerie. Its walls were spray-painted with warnings like "Stay away," "Evil," and "Don't come back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone had tried to ward off something inside. Curiosity got the best of her. Mina pulled over, stepped out into the rain, and switched on her flashlight. She stood outside, her flashlight illuminating the faded words. As she aimed the beam at the house, she froze. In the upstairs window, a young girl stood, staring down at her. Her face was pale, dark circles under her swollen red eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. She didn't move, just watched Mina with a hollow gaze. Mina shivered and called out,
"Hey, are you here alone? Do you need help?"
She mentioned she was looking for a place to stay. The girl tilted her head, her expression unchanged, but her gaze seemed to pierce through Mina. She asked why Mina was here, and warned that she shouldn't have come. The girl then spoke.
"Did you come to see her?"
It was an unsettling question, one that sent a chill through Mina. She had assumed the place was abandoned. Mina asked why the girl was alone and where she was. The girl suddenly smiled, a twisted, eerie grin, and replied,
"Her? She's waiting for a replacement."
The girl's eyes shifted past Mina, her face twisting into terror. A strong gust of wind howled through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched Mina from behind. Mina turned around to see an old woman standing behind her, holding a lantern. The confused expression on her face suggested she had no idea why Mina was standing in front of the abandoned house. Mina explained that she was just a traveler seeking shelter from the storm. She told the old woman about the little girl she had seen through the window, but the woman insisted it was only Mina's imagination. Mina learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and the woman offered her a place to stay overnight at her house. Mina accepted her invitation. It was hard for Mina to believe that the girl she had seen in the abandoned house was merely a figment of her imagination. Yet Mina couldn't shake the feeling that this woman knew more than she was letting on. The house was as antique as its exterior suggested. The furniture was aged, the walls lined with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. The woman, who introduced herself as Lena, led Mina to a seat near the fireplace. Gathering her courage, Mina asked Lena about the abandoned house. Lena told Mina that many years ago, she had moved here with her father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so she quickly befriended a little girl named Lily. Lily's family was large and lively, their house always filled with laughter. Lily's aunt, a warm and kind woman, always had candy for the children, especially for Lily. But one day, her aunt passed away suddenly. The entire family was grief-stricken, everyone except Lily. The little girl didn't shed a single tear, nor did she say a word. Lily just stood at her aunt's funeral, motionless, her eyes lifeless, even as they lowered her into the ground. Lily changed after that day, rarely going outside and spending hours alone in her room. Lily would stay in her room with her Ouija board. She said her aunt had taught her how to use it, and she would spend hours trying to speak to her. As Lena continued her story, Mina could almost picture the events unfolding. Something had changed in the little girl that day, something dark and frightening. Then, she continued telling Mina about what the little girl had gone through since that day. Right after the girl's aunt passed away, terrifying things began happening in that house. Around midnight, Lily's mother started hearing strange noises coming from her room. Scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping against the walls. Lily lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. She felt a presence, something lurking beside her bed, watching her. Mrs. Lena leaned forward. She told Mina how Lily had confided in her older friend, saying she could feel eyes watching her every night, standing at the edge of her bed, silent yet terrifying. The next morning, Lily's mother checked her bed and discovered scratch marks on the mattress. Even more disturbingly, she found similar marks on Lily's own skin. Lily would scream, sometimes even laugh loudly in the middle of the night. Her voice would change, becoming rough, distorted, and filled with pain. Lily's mother rushed in, only to find her alone, trembling, her eyes filled with terror. The little girl spoke of them, shadowy figures. They would gather around her bed, staring with their hollow mouths, open in a silent scream. They all knew Lily was different. Everyone sensed that something had invaded her, but no one could stop it or help her. Mina shuddered as the old woman recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Lily's family summoned priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was one of them, and he placed a crucifix under Lily's pillow, hoping to drive away whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, whispered Latin prayers filling the room. The exorcism turned chaotic. Lily writhed on the bed, growling like an animal, as if the crucifix was causing her unbearable pain. Objects flew across the room, and the crucifix seemed to burn her, sending her into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from Lily's mouth, mixed with a hoarse, guttural laughter. Her body twisted in unnatural ways, eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Lily, and she endured tremendous suffering. During the exorcisms, Lily would roll and vomit, then break into uncontrollable laughter. That voice, it was like a demon disguised in a child's body, coming from the depths of darkness. Once, during an exorcism, Lily suddenly broke free from the priest's hold and lunged at the metal bed frame. She swung it wildly, slashing at the arm of one of the priests, forcing them to halt the ritual. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Lily's body, as if an invisible force was carving them into her skin with a sharp blade. On the last night, 3 priests conducted the final exorcism on Lily, and they even witnessed her body levitating above the bed. As they recited the final incantation, Lily's body collapsed onto the bed, motionless. Everyone believed she had been freed. Lily's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw her again. The people living near the house avoided it, cursing its existence. Some families even left the area due to the strange, unexplainable occurrences. She told Mina that some believed Lily's spirit never left, that she was still trapped inside the house. Mina shivered, recalling the grinning girl in the window, her eyes black and hollow. Mina shared what she had seen. Hesitantly, she mentioned that the girl looked no older than 14. The old woman slowly nodded and confirmed that was exactly Lily's age when she disappeared. Mina was frozen by what she heard. The woman pointed to a small room under the stairs, offering it as a place for her to sleep. She warned Mina once more to stay away from the exorcism house before heading upstairs. Lying on the bed, Mina stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the girl from her mind. She wondered, what if the woman hadn't arrived? Would she have been the next one, just as the girl had said? The sun finally rose, but the memories of the night clung to Mina. She thanked Lena and left, Yet the questions remained. Did Lily die during the exorcism? Was her soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed her? But one thing was certain: Mina would never return to Cottage City again. The Intruder and Courage. Nicky recalled when he was 9 years old. His parents adopted a dog, wanting him to grow up with a companion to help him learn boundaries and discipline, as well as have a playmate. The dog's name was Charlie, a golden retriever. One night, Nicky woke up past midnight and noticed that Charlie had jumped off the bed and was whining at the door. Nicky got up and went downstairs with Charlie. As he walked through the living room, he felt something pass by him that he couldn't even recognize. Nicky led Charlie out into the backyard and stood by the door, waiting for Charlie to quickly finish and come back inside. But when Charlie came back inside, he turned toward the garage door, walked over, and began sniffing intensely. Soon, Charlie's usual curiosity shifted to something else. He began whining, pacing, and scratching at the door more aggressively, finally looking back at Nicky. Nicky hesitated, but Charlie wouldn't stop. Finally, Nicky opened the door and turned on the light. When the lights came on, there was a man wearing a black mask and dressed in all black, trying to break into Nicky's dad's Mercedes. Beneath him was a black bag full of stolen items. The man turned, startled by the light. Charlie immediately began barking, his deep, ferocious growls echoing through the garage. Nicky screamed for his parents, but within moments, the man reacted quickly, rushing over to grab him and cover his mouth. Charlie barked even louder, his desperation clear as he tried to protect Nicky. "Quiet," the man hissed, dragging Nicky toward the car. Charlie lunged, but the man kicked him out the door, sending him sprawling to the ground. His whimpers filled Nicky with heartbreak. Then the thief threw Nicky hard to the ground, leaving him weak and powerless. He leaned down, threatening him to stay quiet or else. After a moment, Charlie was on the other side of the door, barking again. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention back to the car, using a metal tool to try and pry the lock. Nicky sat frozen, trembling as Charlie's relentless barking continued. Moments later, the door burst open, and Nicky's parents rushed in with Charlie. Nicky's father's face contorted with anger as he took in the scene. "Let my son go," he shouted. The man turned around, grabbed Nicky, and put him in a chokehold. Nicky's father froze, and his face shifted from anger to immediate panic. It wasn't clear why until Nicky realized there was a knife pressed against his neck. The man demanded his parents step back, hand over the car keys, and let him drive away, or else he'd hurt the boy. Nicky's mother tightly held onto Charlie's collar, trying to restrain him as the dog growled and struggled against her grip. "Get the keys," Nicky's father said, his voice tense with fear. Nicky's mother turned toward the house, but her grip on Charlie slipped. The dog broke free and charged toward Nicky. The thief removed the knife from Nicky's neck, and the boy instinctively knew he would point it at Charlie. Acting on instinct, Nicky grabbed the knife and pulled it toward himself, the blade slicing through his fingers in agonizing pain. Charlie lunged forward. His jaws tore through the man's pants and clamped tightly onto his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Nicky's father immediately charged at the thief, pulling Nicky and Charlie away from him. Before the thief could react, his protective instincts took over, and he pinned the intruder to the ground, knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until Nicky's mother intervened that everything finally settled. Nicky could barely recall what happened next. All he knew was that the thief spent a long time in the hospital before being taken into custody. Nicky was also relieved that everyone, including Charlie, escaped without serious injury. Even though Charlie was older, he had proven his boundless love and loyalty to Nicky and the family. Mysterious guest at the gas station. Kevin, working at a local gas station, was accustomed to the quiet routine of the night shift. This time, he was covering for someone else, starting from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. He sat behind the counter as heavy rain poured outside, with a major storm looming. Most people seemed to be staying indoors. After sitting inside for an hour, Kevin put on a raincoat and went outside to tidy up and prepare for the approaching storm. As Kevin gathered the last few items, he noticed a man not too far from the gas station. The man was pacing along the roadside, soaked to the bone. It was unusual, though it seemed he might just be waiting for a ride. 2 hours later, thunder began rumbling in the distance, followed by strong winds and heavier rain that shook the building. Realizing the intensity, Kevin rushed to lock the doors and moved to the storage room for safety. About 30 minutes into the storm, it took him several moments to realize that someone was banging on the front door. He left the storage room to check. Someone was outside, looking in and pounding on the door repeatedly. It was a man, and Kevin quickly rushed to unlock the door, thinking the man was in trouble and needed help. The man was soaked. He rushed inside without saying a word and began pacing back and forth across the floor, leaving puddles of water in his wake. Kevin tried asking if he was okay or needed help, but the man just stared with a vacant, hollow expression. Kevin thought it best to stay cautious and alert. The situation became uncomfortable. As the man paced around, Kevin realized he might be dangerous and decided to observe him patiently. The man's drenched coat revealed patches of mud and scratches, and there was a faint metallic smell of blood. His hand showed large, dark bruises. A gut feeling told Kevin that this man might have been involved in some violent incident. His appearance and behavior raised alarm bells in Kevin's mind. Though uneasy, Kevin decided not to escalate the situation, hoping the man would eventually calm down or leave. But the tension only grew as the storm intensified, leaving Kevin to think about his next move. The man seemed oblivious to everything, pacing around and mumbling incoherently. Occasionally, he cast strange glances at Kevin whenever he reached for his phone. Kevin noticed mud on the man's shoes and realized it was clay. He was familiar with it because customers often tracked it in on rainy days. It was a specific type of clay found near a construction site a few miles away. Kevin decided to act.
Would you like some coffee?
He asked, keeping his tone calm. At first, the man hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Kevin poured a cup and handed it to him. The storm outside seemed to be subsiding. While the man was distracted, Kevin quickly scribbled a note under the counter that read, "Call the police," waiting for an opportunity. Luckily, a delivery driver passed by and entered the store. Kevin discreetly signaled to him and handed him the note along with an item. The driver glanced at the note and nodded at Kevin before leaving. The man's behavior became more erratic. He started mumbling to himself. Kevin sensed that the man was on the verge of losing control. The man grew agitated, complaining about a woman who wouldn't stop screaming and how he had to make her quiet. Kevin pieced it together. The missing woman he'd heard about recently could likely be his victim. Kevin used the storm to create a distraction. When lightning struck and the lights flickered, he toppled a stack of metal shelves, startling the man. Amid the chaos, Kevin grabbed a wrench to defend himself if necessary. The man stumbled, spilling his coffee, and Kevin used the confusion to edge closer to the exit. Moments later, red and blue lights reflected off the rain-splattered windows. The police had arrived, tipped off by the delivery driver. The man tried to flee, but was quickly subdued. Kevin led them to the construction site. He deduced from the man's mud-caked, clay-covered shoes. There, they found the missing woman alive, though bound and hidden in an abandoned shed, relieved to see her taken to safety. Kevin stood in the rain, trembling. The storm had passed, but its horrors lingered. Kevin finished his shift in silence. The cursed game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, the house was left to the two of them, growing silent. Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
All right, just this once.
and they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candles suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
Look, Mark.
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night.
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway, lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, "Maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually." Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared. He was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boys' laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. Escape your pursuer at Dunkin' Donuts. Isa worked the night shift at her uncle's Dunkin' Donuts, a small, quiet spot off a lonely highway, struggling with boredom as a violent storm raged outside. Her phone battery died, flickering before finally shutting off. With a sigh, she plugged it into the charger. The empty Dunkin' Donuts felt eerily quiet. Feeling sleepiness creeping in from the stillness of the night shift, Isa got up and headed to the back to make herself a cup of coffee. Trying to stay alert, Isa sat at the corner table, sipping her coffee. The sound of the storm seemed to press in from all directions, making her feel unusually uneasy in the empty store. Just as she took another sip, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. The bell above the door rang, signaling someone had entered. Isa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially during this storm. Blinking, she slowly moved toward the counter, the only light coming from a nearby candle. As Isa lifted the candle, the pale face of a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, her pants torn in multiple places, and her shirt dotted with what looked like dried blood. Isa, horrified, exclaimed,
Oh my God, you scared me. What happened to you? Are you okay?
The woman's eyes were wide with fear, an expression haunted and desperate.
Please,
She gasped.
you have to help me. He's coming. If we don't move fast, he'll kill me.
Before Isa could respond, headlights swept across the window. A blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. The woman grabbed Isa's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail.
We need to hide. Now.
Isa led her to the storage room and locked the door. Chaos ensued as the front door of the store opened again, this time revealing a man in his 40s with cold, sharp eyes. Isa forced a smile, trying to stay calm and keep him from suspecting anything.
Good evening. Can I get you something?
The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the back room, where the door was slightly ajar.
I'm looking for someone. A woman. She came in here, didn't she?
Isa shook her head and said it was just her there. Isa was on high alert. The man kept his hand fidgeting in his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out at any moment. He seemed unconvinced and stepped closer to the counter, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her.
Are you sure?
Things felt wrong. Before Isa could respond, the backroom door burst open. The woman dashed out, holding a fire extinguisher.
Run!
She shouted as she sprayed water into his face, then unleashed a torrent of foam, forcing the man to stagger back, momentarily blinded. They grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter and bolted out the back door into the raging storm, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Freezing, they ran toward the woods. The man wasn't far behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he shouted threats. Finally, they found an abandoned wooden cabin, dilapidated and isolated, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. They immediately began barricading the door with an old table.
What now?
Isa whispered. The woman pulled out a small knife from her pocket and told Isa that, if necessary, they would face him. She had been running from him for weeks and decided it was time to stop hiding. He arrived and began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. Isa and the woman exchanged a look, bracing for whatever would happen next. He burst through the door. The woman charged at him, knocking him off balance. Isa, trembling but determined, swung the baseball bat hard at his head. He collapsed to the floor, dazed. The woman quickly grabbed a rope from the cabin and tied the man up while Isa used his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they uncovered horrifying evidence in his truck, tools for murder and belongings from previous victims, women he had kidnapped and tortured. As the storm began to dissipate, it was finally over. They turned to each other and smiled. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man. The truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow, I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink. and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, hitting him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. The delivery trip was trapped. Leo, a delivery driver working for Amazon, found himself trapped in an unimaginable situation. After a routine delivery took a dark turn, he was making his final delivery of the shift during a heavy thunderstorm. The rain made driving difficult, and he was unfamiliar with the area. The storm calmed slightly after 15 minutes of waiting. Leo glanced at the package on the passenger seat.
Might as well get this over with.
He sighed. After another 20 minutes of driving, his final destination appeared a strange 2-story wooden house, standing alone in a desolate area. Leo parked, grabbed the package, and walked toward the house. He rang the doorbell and waited for the homeowner to respond. The house was completely dark, which made him uneasy. It would be unfortunate if no one was home. He waited, but there was no answer. He rang the doorbell again. Still nothing. Just as Leo turned to leave, he suddenly heard faint footsteps approaching the door. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a thin man with dark circles under his eyes. He just stood there, staring at Leo, without saying a word.
"Sorry for the delay. Here's your package,"
Leo said, handing it to the man. The man took the package and gave a strange smile. As Leo turned to leave, the man spoke.
"Would you like to join us for a birthday party?"
It was an odd request, so Leo politely declined, saying,
"Oh no, thanks. I have a long drive home, and it's already late."
The man began talking about how no one had shown up for his daughter's birthday, and how nice it would be if Leo could stay for a bit. Feeling guilty about the late delivery, and sorry for the child, Leo decided to stay for a little while. As Leo stepped inside, he noticed there was no electricity, only the faint glow of candles, creating an eerie atmosphere. He quietly followed the man, the house so silent that he could hear their footsteps on the wooden floor. They stopped in front of a door and entered a large room, but everything inside struck Leo as deeply unsettling. A large dining table sat in the center of the room, with several covered plates resting on it. Candles flickered, but there were no birthday decorations. This did not feel like a celebration at all. As Leo was glancing around, the man suddenly appeared behind him, shouting,
"Happy birthday!"
He then told Leo to sit down while he went to fetch his daughter. Leo reluctantly sat down, glancing around, but something in his mind kept telling him that he shouldn't be here. Yet, he couldn't leave just yet, so he decided to stay until they cut the birthday cake. 5 minutes passed, but the man never returned. Just as Leo decided to get up and look for him, he heard a strange whimpering sound coming from behind a locked door in the room. Leo slowly approached the door, straining to listen. Someone was whimpering in pain, but the voice was faint, as if they were on the brink of death. He tried turning the doorknob, but it was locked. Bending down, he peeked through the keyhole. What he saw made him freeze in shock. A man was tied to a chair, his body covered in wounds, barely clinging to life. His skin was marked with deep cuts. Leo staggered backward. He turned to run but froze as he heard a voice behind him.
Why the rush, buddy?
In the next instant, a sharp pain struck his head, and his vision blurred. Leo blacked out, only to wake up to a hauntingly cheerful rendition of Happy Birthday playing in the background. His head throbbed as he realized he was tied to a chair at the dining table. Sitting across from him was the same man from before. The man stood nearby, holding a covered plate in his hands, grinning.
Welcome to dinner.
Then he moved from plate to plate, lifting the lids. What lay beneath was unsettling chunks of raw meat, grotesque and unrecognizable. Leo realized it had all been a lie. There was no daughter. This man was a psychopath, and this was how he hunted his victims. Leo screamed, begging for his life, but the man only chuckled coldly. The man picked up a saw from the floor and charged at Leo. Just as he raised it above his head, a loud explosion rang out. The man collapsed onto the floor as police gunfire struck him. Leo couldn't remember how they got him out of the house. Perhaps he had blacked out again. The horrifying truth came to light. The man was a deranged serial killer. The tied-up man was actually a detective who had uncovered the killer's identity and alerted authorities before he was captured. Leo suffered injuries, but he and the man who had tried to save him had both survived. The horror lingered in Leo's mind, especially the killer's final chilling words to the police. "I just have a different taste in food." His eerie smile was the last thing Leo wanted to remember. Midnight flight. Due to his job, Lucas frequently traveled for business to meet clients. He was sitting alone at the airport, waiting for a late-night flight back to Sydney. The clock showed 1 a.m. The area where he was seated was almost deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. Lucas had his headphones on and was engrossed in his phone. The atmosphere felt strangely empty for such a usually busy airport. At that moment, a flight attendant, a woman in uniform with an eerie, unsettling smile, approached him and gently tapped him on the shoulder.
Sir, your flight is about to depart. I think you missed the announcement.
Lucas glanced around and realized he was the only one left in the waiting area. The elderly couple had already left, and there were no other passengers. His flight was scheduled for 1:30 a.m., but it was already 1:15 a.m. He quickly stood up and thanked her, surprised at how fast time had passed. Lucas got up and began following her. As they walked through the airport, he noticed something odd. She seemed to walk with an uneven gait. Then, he noticed a deep scar on her left leg, and her skin looked unusually pale. She led him onto the plane, and as he stepped inside, he was stunned to see that the entire plane was packed with passengers, none of whom he had noticed or seen in the waiting area. The atmosphere inside the plane was eerily silent, so much so that for a moment, he thought no one was breathing. The passengers sat with their heads bowed, not talking, almost motionless. After boarding, she leaned close and whispered in his ear.
Please take your seat, sir.
If he had been alone, he might have screamed. The cold, chilling breath in her whisper made his ears feel frozen. Lucas went to his seat by the window. As he sat down, he noticed a thin man in formal attire seated next to him, but there was something off about his face. Lucas felt the plane was unusually cold, and soon, a foul stench began to permeate the air around him. Lucas fastened his seatbelt and waited for the plane to take off, but none of the other passengers moved or changed their behavior. They all remained silent and expressionless. He told the man next to him,
It's so cold in here.
The man didn't reply. He just sat there with his head bowed. Lucas thought maybe he was asleep or didn't want to talk. Then all the lights began flickering. Suddenly, The emergency alarm blared, and the plane started shaking violently. Lightning flashed across the sky outside. A violent jolt caused luggage to fall from the overhead compartments. He screamed, but the man next to him and everyone else showed no signs of panic. They all sat like statues, seemingly indifferent to what was happening. In a panic, Lucas tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was stuck. Desperate, he shouted for help. Then, he turned to the man next to him, saying,
Excuse me, please wake up. This plane is going to crash. Please, we need to do something, or we're all going to die.
As Lucas struggled, the man next to him slowly looked up. His face was horrifying, with one side severely burned and scarred. He smiled, a chilling, terrifying grin, and said,
They're all dead.
The other passengers now revealed grotesque faces. A spine-chilling, sinister laughter erupted from all of them. They began laughing in unison, a shrill, terrifying sound. Please let me off, he begged. At that moment, his seatbelt came undone, and he ran toward the exit to escape. But the flight attendant suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Her face was now unrecognizable, her body covered in wounds, smeared with blood, and she had a wide, menacing grin. He shoved the flight attendant aside and ran toward the cockpit, hoping to find the pilots. When he opened the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Both pilots were gone, and everything inside was engulfed in flames. His vision began to blur. His head throbbed, and the faint sound of devilish laughter echoed in his ears.
Sir, are you okay?
The voice startled Lucas awake. It was a security guard at the airport, leaning down to check on him. He slowly sat up, his body trembling, and looked around. He was no longer on the plane. Instead, Lucas was lying next to the charred wreckage of what looked like an old airplane. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something worse. The guard told him that this area was restricted.
That plane had been struck by lightning a week ago, and everyone on board, including the flight attendants and pilots, had perished.
Shocked, Lucas stammered that he had been on that plane. He looked at the plane, horrified by what he had just experienced. He knew he had narrowly escaped the dark fate that had befallen the passengers of that ill-fated flight. The ghost of the police station. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a large, old house. I didn't know it held hidden secrets behind its walls. At first, everything seemed perfect, but there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It all started when I couldn't sleep in one particular room. As a child, I cried incessantly until my parents decided to move me to another room, leaving that bedroom for my brother. Years passed, and by the time I was 5, the nightmares began. They weren't ordinary nightmares. They were terrifying. There was always someone visiting me in my sleep. Sometimes a woman in a white dress standing ominously at the foot of my bed. Sometimes a man dressed as a policeman, keeping me from sleeping peacefully. The man, in particular, stood out. He always wore a policeman's uniform riddled with bullet holes. Every night, he would chase me, and I had no idea why. In my dreams, I would run, but no matter how fast I ran, he was always right behind me. I screamed for help, but couldn't make a sound. Night after night, I was trapped in nightmares, and even when I woke up, it wasn't over. I could still feel his presence in the room. Some nights, he wouldn't chase me in my dreams anymore. Instead, it became disturbingly real. He would stand at the foot of my bed, grinning grotesquely and staring at me, his empty gaze piercing through my soul. I lay frozen, tears streaming down my face, helpless as his grotesque face came closer and closer, staring straight into my eyes. It wasn't just me, my parents were also exhausted from the sleepless nights. My mother always tried to reassure me, but in those moments, I could see him standing there, right behind my mother, staring and grinning maliciously. Of course, my mother couldn't see him. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I could feel him somewhere in the house. His presence followed me everywhere, a shadow clinging to my every step. I can feel him behind me as I run down the stairs, his breath on my neck. I start to run to escape it, but I can't shake this feeling. As a teenager, I finally opened up to my mother, recounting every detail about the terrifying figure who had haunted me for years. Her face turned pale as I spoke. She told me something that sent chills down my spine. She said that in the 1930s, this house used to be a police station, a place where justice and tragedy often went hand in hand. It was haunted by the spirit of an officer who was not a friendly person in life. When he died, his spirit returned to the building and refused to leave. It turned out that his office was the room I couldn't sleep in as a child. It's now my brother's bedroom. My mother had also sensed him, felt his presence, and she told me, "Your brother has seen him too," and what he told me afterward sent chills down my spine. Last year, when my brother was 16, the man appeared and yelled at him to get out of his office. My brother, strangely calm as if they were old friends, replied, "No, this will be my room now. You're dead. Why don't you leave?" What shocked me was that my brother told me the man's demeanor changed after that conversation. Over time, his attitude softened, and they even had short conversations now and then. I was stunned. My brother had lived with this terrifying presence for years, yet he kept it all to himself. I asked him why he never told anyone. He simply said he knew no one would believe him. Eventually, we moved out when my sister was born. The new house was free of ghosts, and I was relieved to leave that nightmare behind after 8 long years. But what about my brother? For the first 2 years in the new house, the man continued to visit him. But now he was different, no longer frightening, just a shadow at the edge of the room, silently watching. My brother said he no longer sees the man and believes he has finally found peace. Hearing that, I felt an incredible sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The man had moved on. But to this day, my brother and I still see spirits. None, however, have ever frightened me like the man from the police station. The dark truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
You will die, as I did.
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. Driving down the dark stretch of road, those words kept echoing in his mind.
You will die, as I did.
Growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, no figure, no movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. He felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, They uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow, as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish, as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes, her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. The madness of the masked man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it, but as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, a shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips as if daring her to approach.
"Come outside, Susan."
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan, I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
Jeff?
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily. As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. The obsession of the stalker. It was 2 years ago. I worked the night shift from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. The store was located on a secluded road in a quiet rural area. Few people came during those hours, mostly regulars stopping by for beer or snacks. On a typical night, I could expect 10 to 20 customers. It was an ordinary job, the kind you do to make a living, and I never anticipated anything out of the ordinary. Then, one evening, around midnight, a man walked in. He was probably in his 30s. At first, he seemed normal, and nothing unusual happened. But then, he started making strange noises, loud, uncontrolled yells. At first, I thought he might have a mental disability or be unwell. My brother has a similar condition, so I felt some sympathy for him. He didn't come to the counter like most customers. Instead, he stood there, staring at the ceiling, his eyes fixed on some distant point above, making unsettling noises. I felt uneasy, unsure how to handle the situation. I tried talking to him, but he only continued making those incomprehensible, strange sounds. I kept checking outside to see if he had come with anyone, but the parking lot was empty. It seemed he had walked here from somewhere unknown. He stood there for so long, staring at the ceiling and making noises that I finally tried to get him out by handing him a bag of chips and saying, "You can go now." He didn't seem to care, lost in his own world. But then, suddenly he turned and walked out of the store. I felt an odd mix of relief and fear. The man was strange, but at least he was gone. About an hour later, the phone rang. I picked it up, but the moment I heard the same loud yell as before, I froze. It was him again. I slammed the phone down, unsure what to think. I started checking outside. Every little noise startled me, and I kept looking outside until 4 a.m. when my replacement finally arrived. My shift was over, and I was allowed to go home. I left the store as quickly as I could and went home. I threw my stuff on the table, ready to go to bed. But then, less than a minute after I walked in the door, the phone rang again. A chill ran down my spine. Who could be calling at 4 a.m.? I braced myself for the worst. It was him again, those unmistakable screams. Quickly hanging up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drew the curtains, locked the doors, and refused to sleep until morning. During a night camera check, I saw him standing in a dark corner, just a few meters from my door, holding a knife and grinning eerily. Terrified, I thought about moving somewhere else. The next day, I went back to my night shift. While checking the stockroom, a sudden blow to the head knocked me down. Pain seared through me as everything went black. When I woke up, I found myself tightly tied to an old chair with rope in the store's stockroom. Before I could process what was happening, he stood before me, his haunted eyes glaring as he screamed about my brother.
He was always loved and cared for. What about me? I was abandoned, treated like trash.
He pulled out a knife and stepped closer, his face twisted with jealous rage. Realizing I couldn't escape by force, I knew I had to manipulate him psychologically and began talking to him. "Maybe you're right. I can't understand your pain, but I can help." He hesitated, his eyes flashing with a glimmer of hope. "I know you just want someone to understand you, don't you? If you untie me, I'll do whatever you want." He untied me but kept the knife in hand. I told him there was a surprise if he let me blindfold him. Using a piece of cloth from the stockroom, I blindfolded him. Quickly, I used the rope to tie him to the chair. When he realized what was happening, he began struggling violently. Keeping a safe distance, I said, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you hurt anyone else. I'll come back with help." I left, shut the stockroom door, and quickly called the police, leading them to the scene. Before they took him away, I told him, "I can't fully understand what you've been through, but I know you're not a bad person." He looked at me with eyes full of pain and inner conflict. Then he broke into tears. The police took him away, saying they would take him to a better treatment facility. I hoped my words had planted a seed of change in his mind. Back home, I found notes detailing my habits, like, "Nico returns at 4:15 a.m., turns on the living room light at 4:18 a.m. This proved he had been watching me for a long time. But now, it was finally over. Months later, I received a letter from a mental health center. It was a short note from him, thanking me. I felt a wave of relief. I decided to move to a new place, start a new job, and live a more peaceful life. Though I occasionally think about what happened, I no longer feel afraid. The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
"I see you."
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
"I see you."
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party, and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside. It still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
Come closer.
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed, but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again, I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. The final trip. Christy was an Uber driver. She enjoyed the flexibility it offered her, but she was also aware of the risks. Many people warned her that Uber might not be a safe job for a woman. She had never been scared and didn't believe such situations were real. But when you're the mother of 3 kids and struggling to give them a good life, you take risks. One night, Christy experienced a harrowing situation that proved all the warnings she had received were true. That night, at 10:30 p.m., Christy accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Christy arrived, she saw him wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. Something about his demeanor made her uneasy, but she reminded herself to stay calm and professional. That was her first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with hardly any reaction, pulling his hood down to hide his face. Many passengers did this when uncomfortable with her filming the trip, but it was also something that made her feel safer. Calvin said nothing and stared out the window, making Christy feel uneasy. She tried not to dwell on it and focused on the road, but her discomfort grew. Just minutes away from the destination, the increasingly deserted road made her fear. Her worst nightmare was coming true. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something hard and cold against her neck. It was a gun. He growled, "Turn left at the next exit, and don't ask any questions." She trembled, begging him not to hurt her because she had kids at home who depended on her. But he pressed the gun harder against her. The car stopped in an isolated clearing. Calvin ordered Christy out. He turned off her phone and took the car keys. Desperation filled her as her mind raced to find a way to escape. They moved deeper into the woods. Calvin shoved her forward, the gun still pressed against her back. Reaching a clearing, he rummaged through her belongings for anything of value. He found a small amount of cash, but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Christy realized this was her moment to act. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and quickly sprayed it into his face. He screamed in pain, and Christy seized the opportunity to escape, running as fast as she could. Panic fueled her speed. The place was pitch dark, and Christy ran blindly, each step bringing her closer to either freedom or death. Branches scratched and cut her skin as she ran, but none of that mattered now. She just wanted to survive. Ahead, Christy spotted a light in the distance, a potential way out of the forest. As she ran, she could hear Calvin's footsteps getting closer, and her hope of escape began to fade. Another mistake happened. Christy, distracted by looking back at him chasing her, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle. As she tried to get up, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked it. She begged, "Please don't kill me. I gave you everything I had." In response, he threw her against a nearby tree. In pain and despair, she obeyed him, kneeling and begging for her life. Christy was waiting for something to happen, for someone to save her, but perhaps this was her chance to save herself. While he was catching his breath from running and rubbing his eyes in pain, Christy quietly reached behind her and grabbed a rock. Without thinking much, she struck him on the head with the rock. Blood streamed down his face as he staggered. Despite her twisted ankle, she ran toward the light she had seen earlier. A narrow stream, quietly flowing through the forest, caused her to pause for a moment. Thinking of her children, she waded through the stream, knowing the sound of the water would mask her footsteps and hide her movements. The pain in her ankle was nothing compared to the horror of what would happen if Calvin caught her. She crawled through the bushes, her body aching, but her will to survive stronger than ever. When she reached the road, her body was exhausted, but she could hear the faint sound of an approaching car. Christy staggered toward the roadside, frantically waving her arms, barely able to speak. "Please, I need help. He's chasing me. Please." A woman immediately stopped her car and ran to Christy, calling the police. And that was when Christy's vision blurred as she collapsed from exhaustion. Christy, now safe, was able to assist the authorities in building a case against him, leading to his arrest and prosecution. Despite her injuries, Christy found peace and gratitude in knowing she had survived. She could see her children again. She had conquered her fear and emerged stronger. The house in the woods of the stranger. Mai's family loved traveling whenever there were holidays. They often went on short trips, and back then, Mai was probably only 10 years old. Mai's father rented a small house in the woods, in a farm-like area with scattered small houses. It was a quiet tourist spot, mostly visited by campers and hikers. At that time, they were the only tenants staying on the property, or at least, that's what the landlord told Mi's family. The fresh air, the tranquility of the lake, and the chirping of birds made her love the place. Mi's father took her out on a boat to the middle of the lake to fish. It was her first time, and she was thrilled. Suddenly, Mi noticed a large tree to the left and felt as if someone, a shadowy figure, was standing under the tree watching them. "Dad, who is that?" she asked her father and pointed in that direction, but the figure disappeared as soon as Mi pointed it out. Her father dismissed her worries, and they returned to the house for lunch. Back from the lake, Mi's mother set up a small table and chairs for snacks while preparing for dinner. After the meal, Mi thought about wandering off to play and explore a bit. Her mother called out, reminding her not to go too far. Mi started walking around, but suddenly she saw a rabbit hopping about. Excited, she began following it. The rabbit hopped into a nearby bush, and she ran over and started searching through the bush. Suddenly, she heard rustling footsteps behind her. Thinking it was the rabbit, she turned around. Mi turned around and saw a man standing there with a strange smile. He was holding the rabbit she had just seen. His smile was creepy, but Mi, in her innocence, didn't think much of it. He raised an eyebrow at her and said, "Looking for this rabbit, little girl? Do you want to pet it?" Mi innocently told him, "But my mom says they always run away. They won't run if you put them in a cage." He scratched his head and said he didn't have a cage, but mentioned he had one at his house. Then, he suggested Mi come with him. Mi knew it was a big warning sign, but at 10 years old, all she could think about was the rabbit. So, she agreed to go with the man. The man's eyes lit up. He led Mi through the woods, and after a short walk, they arrived at another house that looked exactly like the one her family was staying in. Mi felt a bit surprised. Inside, the dim, shadowy light revealed a filthy and cluttered house with old, muddy clothes scattered across the floor. She began to smell an intensely unpleasant stench. Mi held the rabbit in her arms while he went into another room. After a moment, he called out, asking if she could come and help him. Mi stood up and stepped into the room, where the stench grew even stronger. The room was very dark, with a dirty, tattered piece of cloth hanging over the window. Small beams of sunlight filtered through the tiny holes, barely lighting the room. It took her a moment to realize there was a bed in the room, and lying on it appeared to be a woman. In the dim light, she could make out a skeletal hand, covered in horrifying sores. Mi began to feel that something was very wrong. She stepped back and said, "I need to go back. My mom is waiting for me." The situation had become alarming, and she realized she needed to leave. The man's face twisted into a displeased frown. Before she could move, he lunged forward, grabbed her, and lifted her off the ground. He muttered something strange. "Touch this little one, darling. It might cure your illness." Mi struggled and screamed for help, but he held her tightly, dragging her closer to the figure on the bed. The stench grew more overwhelming. Just as he was about to force her closer to the woman, Mi kicked him in the face and grabbed the curtain, pulling it down. He fell to the floor, clutching his bleeding nose. Mi also fell, and the entire curtain came down, flooding the room with sunlight. For the first time, Mi saw the woman clearly. Her peeling skin resembled that of a corpse. The decaying body lunged toward Mi, bony hands reaching out to grab her. She screamed and backed away like prey before a predator. Suddenly, Mi's father burst into the room, shouting her name. He rushed to her, lifted her off the floor, and carried her out of the cabin as quickly as he could. The woman's skeletal hands clawed at the air. Mi was carried out of the house, fainting in the process. The story that unfolded afterward shocked everyone. The man and the woman were escaped criminals who had fled into the woods to hide. The woman was severely infected due to poisoning. She claimed to know magic, and they believed that using an innocent child could heal her, transferring her illness to another body. When medics took the woman to the hospital, she died within a week. The man was arrested for attempted kidnapping and returned to prison, where he faced additional charges. Mai still cannot shake the image of that sickly woman crawling toward her. She no longer wants to travel to the woods or stay in cabins. Thankfully, her father arrived just in time. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Ni, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Ni walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Ni's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Ni began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Ni stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Ni found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Ni had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Ni drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Ni approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Ni called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Ni, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Ni tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nee heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, when the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place,
he cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nee played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nee found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nee collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nee didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. Escape from the terrifying snowstorm night. This happened a few New Year's Eves ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. A simple trip. I was used to long drives. Snow started falling about an hour into the drive. Light at first, but it kept coming until I found myself in the middle of a snowstorm. The highway grew slippery, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, a small one, wasn't built for driving in the snow. The tires slid even on the smallest incline, and I realized I needed to stop. I texted my parents about my situation to reassure them, but honestly, I wasn't so sure myself. An hour passed, and the snow only got worse. I began worrying about running out of gas or draining the battery by keeping the heater on too long. I kept the engine running, hoping the storm would ease. The wind howled outside. I began to feel the weight of isolation when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm behind me. I felt an overwhelming relief as a snowplow stopped beside me. Finally, someone had come to help. The truck slowed and stopped beside me. It was the driver, a man leaning out the window. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a thick coat and a black knit cap pulled down over his ears. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had smoked for years.
Are you okay?
He asked. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, and he said to get in, that he'd take me somewhere safe. He got out of the truck. I hesitated. I didn't know this man, and he seemed a little strange, but he appeared sincere. The storm was relentless, and staying wasn't an option. All right, I replied, then asked if he could take me to my destination. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting quickly behind my car, as if looking for something. Then, without a word, he told me to get in. The warmth inside the snowplow was a relief compared to the biting cold outside. We didn't talk much during the ride, but as the minutes passed, I began to sense something strange. As I glanced out the window, I realized we weren't heading toward my parents' house. The surroundings looked unfamiliar. A lingering unease crept in. I asked, trying to sound casual, "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't look at me and said it was a shortcut. At least GPS showed we were going the right way, so I figured I was just being paranoid. I glanced around the truck. Everything was a mess. Empty whiskey bottles and torn maps stuffed into the side compartments. My eyes stopped at something wedged between the seats, a knife, half hidden under the chair. Suddenly, I saw a small house ahead, the only house I'd seen after a long stretch of emptiness. I knew I had to act before something bad happened. A sense of foreboding washed over me. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. I flung the door wide and ran into the snowstorm. The blizzard made visibility almost zero. The thick snow slowed my steps, but I pressed on toward the faint light of the wooden house. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. The snowplow driver didn't give up. He rummaged through the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun, yelling,
Get back here! You're not going anywhere!
As I neared the house's door, he fired the gun. I thought I'd used up all my luck when the bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a painful wound. Staggering, I banged on the wooden door, shouting for help. A man appeared with a shotgun in hand. Before I could explain, he seemed to understand and quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut. He stayed outside, shouting, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He fired the gun again, the bullet shattering a large piece of the window. The hunter, with no other choice, opened the door and charged outside with the shotgun. The two of them wrestled in the blizzard, the gun falling from their hands. I couldn't just stand there. Before he could act, I picked up the shotgun and aimed it straight at him. As he hesitated, the hunter took the opportunity to tackle him to the snow-covered ground and tied him up with a rope. A short while later, the police arrived, and he was arrested. I was so grateful to the hunter for saving me, and relieved I had made the right decision to jump out of that truck. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple: a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
"Who's there?"
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost.
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
"This road isn't for wandering. You should leave,"
he muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup, and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut. A place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with a sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The truck driver's nightmare chase. I'm Alan, and I want to tell you about my job. The only job I've ever had, and definitely one of the most dangerous. I'm a truck driver, often driving for hours, almost always sleep-deprived and in a rush, and worse, in the dark. Aside from the fear of crashing or falling asleep at the wheel, People always ask me if I have any stories to tell. That night, I was driving with my companion, Randy. Randy had recently gone through a divorce and didn't have kids, so he didn't have much going on. He'd had a few drinks that day and was a bit tipsy. As I looked out the window, I saw a lot of police cars speeding past me. They seemed in a hurry, as if searching for someone. I didn't think much of it and kept driving. After a while, I decided to stop so Randy could use the bathroom and we could take a break. I waited, but after a few minutes, my unease grew as Randy didn't return. Worried, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods. "Hey buddy, you out there?" Randy didn't answer. I didn't think he could be drunk enough to pass out, so I kept following the trail into the woods. I moved through the bushes, calling Randy's name. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a strange tapping sound coming from behind a large tree. Cautiously, I moved closer, thinking Randy might be playing a prank. I approached and saw a girl leaning against a tree, covered in blood and trembling in fear. I rushed to help her, but then I saw a knife in her hand and stepped back. "Hey, what happened to you? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The girl stood up without answering. Instead, she began moving toward me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't identify. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm, but she didn't stop. I noticed her legs were covered in blood, but there was something off about her posture. Amidst the chaos, I heard a noise and turned around. What shocked me more was my friend Randy. He was in danger. Randy was sitting under a tree not far away, pale and injured, with blood streaming from his side. He was alive but weak. "I'll save you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my panic. But before I could act, she lunged at Randy with a ravenous look in her eyes. Without thinking, I screamed to draw her attention, luring her away from Randy. She turned to look at me, grinning eerily.
It's hunting time.
I sprinted through the trees, dodging sharp branches like claws. She chased close behind, her pounding footsteps echoing in my ears, making my heart feel like it would burst. While running, I tripped over a rock, tumbling to the ground. She lunged at me, and I had to wrestle with her, holding back her wild fury for a moment. She seemed intent on devouring me. My breath caught as her hand slipped, stabbing the knife into the ground just inches from where it could have ended me. I shoved her off me, grabbed a large branch and swung it hard, striking her. Her pained scream echoed through the forest as the knife fell from her hand. Pain blurred my vision, but I knew I couldn't stop. Even injured, she continued chasing me, her breath ragged like a wild beast. Using all my knowledge of the forest, I took a gamble. I changed direction, heading toward where I suspected there was a bear trap. She was still close behind me. Nearing the trap, I slowed down deliberately before suddenly leaping aside. She charged forward, unaware of the trap. Snap! The steel jaws slammed shut with a deafening clang. The woman screamed in agony as her leg was caught in the trap. Without hesitation, I ran back to Randy. He was visibly weaker, but still alive. I quickly used a handkerchief to stop the bleeding from his wound. I helped him into the truck. Every step felt like a battle, but I didn't stop. Finally, I got him into the vehicle and drove away as fast as I could. On the way, I came across a patrolling police car. They quickly arrived and arrested the woman. They said she was an outcast living in the forest, hunting and attacking anyone who wandered into the area. Even her clothing had belonged to previous victims. In her hideout, the police found evidence that she had resorted to cannibalism and many other horrifying items. Randy survived, but the wounds, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. I couldn't forget that night either, but I told myself that I had done everything to save my friend. And when facing darkness, You must fight to survive. The sinister plan of the imposter. Leo, a 13-year-old boy, was sent to stay with his Uncle Donnie in a remote, isolated town for a few weeks, while his mother resolved some personal matters. He never imagined this visit would turn into a nightmare. When Leo first arrived, Uncle Danny was a warm and friendly man, welcoming him with open arms. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The house was old but cozy. However, as time passed, Leo began noticing strange things. Uncle Danny's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at the walls, mumbling to himself, and engaging in peculiar habits. One evening, Leo spotted his uncle in the yard with a net and a glass jar, seemingly catching something peculiar. Then, Uncle Danny brought it to the backyard balcony. What Leo saw next left him frozen in disbelief. Leo saw his uncle holding a larva. To his horror, Uncle Danny calmly placed it into his mouth, swallowing it without any sign of disgust. Leo tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just an eccentricity, but the strangeness grew. Uncle Danny's cooking became odd. Once delicious meals now looked disturbing, sometimes containing unrecognizable ingredients. One night, Leo started suspecting something far worse was happening. He called his mother, explaining what he had witnessed, but she didn't believe him at first. He needed evidence. Leo's unease grew as Uncle Danny became increasingly distant and frightening. At night, Leo began hearing strange noises coming from his uncle's room. Uncle Danny even avoided eye contact, something he never did before. His smiles became forced and unsettling. One afternoon, Leo snuck into the kitchen to take pictures and videos of his uncle, preparing another strange meal. The photo shocked him. From this angle, his uncle looked unrecognizable, his features distorted. Terrified, Leo sent the photo to his mother. Her initial skepticism turned into horror. She called him back. "Leo, you need to stay calm. Just wait there. I'll come get you," she reassured him, though Leo could hear the anxiety in her voice. As time passed, Leo began to feel an overwhelming pressure. He couldn't just wait. He had to do something before it was too late. He remembered his mother mentioning Uncle Danny's insomnia. Recalling the bottle of sleeping pills in the bathroom, Leo quietly took it and slipped it into his pocket as he tiptoed into the kitchen. Uncle Danny was there, his back turned to Leo as he prepared something with a foul, frightening smell. Leo quickly crushed the pills and mixed them into the food. That night, Uncle Danny ate the food without suspicion, but he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Leo sat in his room, waiting. The storm outside raged on, and the world beyond seemed to be closing in on him. His mother called again, telling him that a light snowstorm was sweeping through the area, but she would try to get there as soon as possible. Time was running out. Hours passed. Leo couldn't take it anymore. He had to ensure his mother would arrive. He went downstairs, and that's when he saw him again. Uncle Donnie approached Leo in a frightening manner, but Leo smiled, acting as though nothing was wrong. Leo told him his mother was coming to visit, and that she said she was very hungry. He asked if Uncle Danny could help him prepare a meal for her. Leo breathed a sigh of relief when his uncle froze for a moment before smiling and agreeing. It felt like a narrow escape. Leo needed to come up with more ways to stall for time until his mother arrived. The upcoming moments would be a living nightmare. After a while, Uncle Danny went to the back of the house, while the snow outside continued to fall heavily. The ticking of the old clock seemed louder in the silence. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a man standing on the doorstep, his face pale and cold. He introduced himself as being from the town hospital saying that Uncle Danny hadn't shown up for his volunteer shifts in days and hadn't been heard from. Leo didn't know how to respond, unsure if his suspicions were correct, so he simply said Uncle Danny was out. The man left, but Leo's unease continued to grow. Later, while Uncle Danny was away, Leo didn't know what to do, so he began exploring the house and discovered secrets in the basement. When he opened the basement door, the room was cluttered with old boxes and furniture. He found jars filled with strange, wriggling creatures, along with the rancid stench of rotting food. Among the mess, Leo found an old photo of two people, a woman and a man. The man looked strikingly like Uncle Danny, only older and slightly different. The snowstorm worsened. The lights flickered, and eventually, the house was plunged into darkness. Leo used the dim glow of his phone flashlight and slowly crept up the stairs. He wandered toward the living room aimlessly. Then suddenly, a creaking sound came from somewhere in the house. In the living room, through the faint light streaming in from outside, Leo saw a figure sitting on a chair, facing the wall. It was a familiar silhouette. The silence in the room was stifling. Without warning, Uncle Danny suddenly turned around, his wild, vacant eyes glaring at Leo. "You think I didn't know, Leo?" Leo froze, fear washing over him. His heart pounded as if it wanted to escape his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his hands began trembling. Donnie took a step closer, leaning in, his voice low and tense. "You ate the cake in my fridge, didn't you?" Leo froze, his eyes wide, muttering a vague apology and offering an excuse to deflect suspicion. In truth, he didn't even know the cake existed. Moments later, the lights came back on, and Leo tried to think of a way to stall until his mother arrived. In his anxiety, he recalled Uncle Danny once mentioning a small cellar under the kitchen where he kept special items. He asked his uncle to retrieve an item for him, claiming he was afraid of the dark and confined spaces. Donnie paused, staring at Leo with a puzzled expression. "All right, Leo," he said, his voice slow, as though contemplating something. Then he uttered a chilling sentence. "One last time, I'll indulge you." Danny bent down, yanking the cellar door open. The hinges screeched loudly in the eerie silence as he squinted into the darkness below. The cellar was pitch black, and a musty odor wafted out, forcing Leo to step back to steady himself. As Danny was halfway into the cellar, Leo suddenly heard him let out a cold, menacing chuckle. Then he stopped, looked up at Leo and said, "You know, Leo, there's so much more to discover down here. Would you like to come in?" Leo shuddered, fear rising in his throat. But he managed to keep his composure and immediately declined. Donnie laughed loudly, then continued descending into the cellar. Once he was completely out of sight, Leo realized he had only one chance. But at that moment, Donnie suddenly looked up, his eyes gleaming like a predator spotting prey, shouting to ask what Leo was doing. Leo didn't answer, quickly stepping forward, grabbing the cellar door and slamming it shut with all his strength. Donnie roared from below, his screams a mix of rage and panic. He hurriedly slid the latch to lock the cellar door. From below, Donnie's pounding on the door echoed fiercely. When the police and his mother arrived, Donnie was pulled out of the cellar in a completely unhinged state. He screamed and repeated nonsensical words about the darkness. Leo's mother couldn't believe her eyes, as they had initially believed this man was Uncle Danny. But now, the truth was undeniable. He was a psychiatric patient. During one of Uncle Danny's volunteer shifts at the hospital, where the man was being treated, he had met Danny and felt a strange connection. He became increasingly obsessed with Uncle Danny's life. When Danny mentioned Leo's upcoming visit, he decided it would be fun to experience that life, taking Danny's place. His mother held him tightly after everything they had just learned. It was over, but the pain of the loss and the truth about his late uncle would haunt Leo in sleepless nights to come. The nightmare trip on Christmas Day. In December, my girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Poco Mountains. We had rented a small wooden cabin that looked super cozy, decorated with Christmas ornaments, and had a beautiful view. That night, there was a snowstorm forecast, so we left a bit earlier to have time to buy groceries. After that, we headed straight to the cabin. The house was surrounded by forest, and we had to make several trips from the car to bring everything inside. I did the usual things, like checking the fridge, turning on the TV to see if there was cable or Netflix, and looking out all the windows to make sure everything was fine. Then there was a basement for recreation. I went down to check it out. It was quite large compared to the size of the house. It felt detached from the cabin, dark, and rather chilly. Then there was a knock on the front door. I hurried upstairs to answer it. I was surprised and confused to see a guy who looked like he was in his late 40s. He wore gray sweatpants and a tattered tan jacket. He smiled at me and asked,
"How's everyone doing?"
I started asking if he was the owner. He introduced himself as Tom and said he ran the place with his brother. Tom said he lived just up the road if my girlfriend and I needed anything. At that moment, I found it a bit odd that he knew I was with my girlfriend. He left quickly. We continued watching a Christmas movie and enjoying the quiet, but an uneasy feeling started to creep in. When I went to shower, I was startled as the water suddenly turned ice cold. I quickly got out and texted Mike, the cabin owner, asking if there was an issue with the water heater. Mike replied a while later, saying he'd send someone to check it the next day. Around midnight, we woke up to loud banging on the front door. Charlotte shook me awake, terrified. I said I'd check to see who it was, but she was terrified, begging me to stay in the room and keep quiet. The knocking continued, growing louder and more persistent, before suddenly stopping. We sat upright in silence for a few minutes, whispering to each other. I went to lock the bedroom door to feel safer. After a while of staying alert, we eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there was a lot of snow outside, and it was a cloudy, gloomy day. I stepped out to clear the snow off my car. While doing so, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow. They circled around the house. I heard footsteps approaching, and I saw Tom suddenly appear. He said,
"Is everything okay?"
I started telling him about what we had experienced the previous day. He even laughed at me, saying I was being paranoid, and assured me he would help check the water heater, which we had complained about earlier. Tom offered to check the water heater. Reluctantly, I agreed to follow him to the basement. At that moment, I texted Mike that Tom was here and helping me check the water heater, but Mike hadn't replied yet. Once in the basement, Tom said he needed to grab some tools from the house next door. But then, he slammed the door shut, startling me, and I had no idea what was happening. Then I heard the click of a lock, indicating the door had been locked. Before I could react, my phone buzzed with a message from Mike. He texted, "Is Tom the plumber's name?" I replied, "No, he said he's your brother." Mike then replied, "No, who is this person?" Frozen with fear, I sent a voice message. "Help me. He's here, I'm trapped, and my girlfriend is in danger." Just then, Charlotte's scream rang out. I panicked, banging on the door. A moment later, the door finally opened. In a panic, I ran upstairs and saw Tom restraining Charlotte, covering her mouth. She saw me, and while he was distracted, hit his hand. In pain, he pushed her away. At that moment, I felt a surge of strength to protect my girlfriend. I charged at him and punched him in the face, causing him to collapse temporarily. During that moment, we managed to escape the house with great difficulty, running through the snow to reach our car and driving away immediately. When I called Mike for help, he immediately contacted the police. Mike apologized for the unfortunate events and called to report the man named Tom, who had impersonated his brother. The story behind Tom's behavior involved a psychological trauma from his past. His partner had abandoned him for an extended period. He began impersonating the homeowner's brother to easily infiltrate couples' lives, creating a sense of familiarity, then stalking and observing them when they weren't paying attention, ultimately plotting to harm and separate them. Charlotte and I finally understood the reason behind Tom's behavior, and although we escaped the danger, we could never forget the terrifying hours we endured.